I'll start the story as I always do with a small disclaimer. I'm making no assertion that this is any kind of UFO close encounter. The only thing I will tell you is that I have no idea what was in the woods that night, and everything you're about to hear is true. This whole thing started circa 1975 in the homestead in the backwoods of Alaska. On our property, we had two small cabins. We had a lower cabin and we had an upper cabin. My brother George and his wife were living in the upper cabin. The rest of my family was in the lower cabin. And it was about this time of the year. It was late autumn. There had been some snow flurries. The leaves were off the trees. And, of course, as it is the case in Alaska this time of the year, it was a lot of darkness. Gone were the long days of summer. We were now into the beginning of winter. My brother George had gone up to the upper cabin for the night, and we had all turned in. And he came bursting through the front door and yelling about a blue light behind the cabin. None of us knew what was going on. So we all kind of got up and got around and went out into the front yard and looked back up the hillside to the upper cabin. Behind the upper cabin, probably, I'm going to say twice the size of the cabin, was a blue pulsating orb. And when I say blue, it was the type of blue, almost like the blue of like an arc welder, like an electric blue. And it was behind the upper cabin, just pulsing. I should also say that before we even went out into the yard, it really sounded like there was a hurricane outside. There was just this immense amount of wind, and you could hear trees being uprooted and trees snapping and trees falling down left and right. It really sounded like every tree in the woods were just being ripped apart. It sounded like that, although there was no wind. You had the sound of wind and you had the sound of trees being uprooted, but as we stood in the yard, there was no wind. There was no wind blowing. There was just the sound of wind. You also have to remember that at this time, it was probably the peak of the Cold War. And we were right on, of course, the doorsteps of Russia and then the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of military and there was a lot of things going on in Alaska at that time. And our first instinct was not, oh, hey, here's a UFO. Our first instinct was, what is going on? What's happening? Is this a military thing? And my mother even said at the time, because of the wind and the sound and all the trees, that maybe a helicopter had crashed behind the cabin. And my brother Rick, he wanted to go up and investigate. My mother was having no part of that. She was a little bit, I think we were all, other than my brother Rick, I think we were all a little bit scared. And so we didn't know what to do. So we're all standing out there looking at this thing, and I really don't know how much time went by. A few moments passed, maybe 10 minutes, while we were figuring out what should we do? How do we proceed? My brother said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to fire a shot into the air, and if they're in distress, if somebody's up there, they'll send up a flare, they'll signal back, they'll indicate in some way that they need help, and then we can proceed. So my mother said, okay, just fire one shot into the air, and if they need help, then we'll help them. Now, it's at this point in the story where things take a decided turn. My brother fired a shot into the air. Now, the light, which was at the time much bigger than the cabin, immediately shrunk down to a size where it was actually smaller than the cabin. It was still behind the cabin. We could still see light around the cabin, but this big light that was back there was now smaller than this small cabin. And we all had the same sense at about the same time that something was coming towards us. The light stayed stationary, but there was something or someone coming down the hill towards us. We didn't wait around. We ran into the cabin and we shut the door, and classic put a chair against the door kind of thing. And my brother Rick had a rifle. My brother George grabbed a rifle. I grabbed a rifle. I had a little single shot 22 that didn't eject shells, and I had to dig them out with a butter knife. But I had my gun at the ready, and we were ready to deal with whatever was going to hit that door. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and it just sounded like the world was coming to an end outside the cabin. The wind was howling, and trees were breaking, and it was just a din of noise. And my mom said, well, this is crazy. I'm calling the state troopers. She got on the phone. She called the state troopers. She said, I don't know what's going on. There's a light out in the woods. And, of course, they went, oh, okay, here we go. And he said, okay, well, we'll be out there in a little while. So, again, we lived quite a ways away from anybody else. So a good amount of time passed before the troopers showed up. And I can only tell you those were the longest minutes/hours of my life. As we were sitting in this cabin, it sounded like the world was ending outside the cabin, and we didn't know what was going on or what was going to hit that door at any second. Finally, off in the distance, I heard a siren. And, boy, I was just relieved. And even before I could say, hey, here comes the police, all sound outside the cabin stopped immediately. I mean, it was just 1 minute it was there, and the next minute, complete silence. It's a knock on the door. We open the door. It's a state trooper. They're like, what's going on? So we tell them the story, and they, of course, think we're crazy. They get in the, well, we'll file a report, and they get in the car, and they leave. Well, needless to say, nobody was sleeping that night. And so we stayed up the next night, or we stayed up that night. The next day, everybody went, their separate ways, and we sat there all night long trying to figure out what just happened. What just took place? And like I said, the next day, everybody goes their way. I go to school. My brothers go to school. As it happened, schedule-wise, I used to get home a half an hour before my brothers. They were in higher grades, and I would always get home about a half an hour before them. So I got home the next day, and I was by myself. I wasn't really concerned about, I don't know, I wasn't concerned about the situation last night, and, I wasn't thinking about it too much. So I walked up the steps to our cabin, and I opened the door, and immediately the phone rang. I answered the phone, and before I could even say, I think I did say hello, but before I could say anything else, the voice on the other end of the line said, "Hello, Terry. This is Lieutenant Brown. How are you feeling today?" And I said, I feel fine. And he said, "Okay." And he hung up. I didn't think about it, to be honest with you. I was a little boy. I don't know. I don't even remember if I even mentioned it to my parents. I don't think that I did. For the next 2 weeks, every day, when I would come home from school, before I could even finish walking through the door, the phone would ring, and the guy would say the same thing. "Hello, Terry. This is Lieutenant Brown. How are you feeling today?" I would say fine, and he would hang up. And that went on for 2 weeks. My mother actually called Elmendorf Air Force Base And she said, listen, you don't have to tell me if there was something going on, if you were testing something. I understand military secrets and so on, but I just need to know if my family's in danger. And again, this is the middle of the Cold War. We didn't know what was going on. She just said, I want to know if my family's in danger. Just tell me that. And they said, no, we have no idea what you're talking about, but you're in absolutely no danger. And then one day, the phone calls stopped, and I never heard another word. The next day, or maybe a couple days after the incident, my brothers and I did go back up onto the hill and see if we could find anything. There were no trees uprooted. There were no trees knocked over, other than maybe a couple here and there that could have been just, basic winter storm stuff. But based on what I heard that night, you would think maybe 100 acres of trees had been ripped up. And there were no trees ripped up. There were no trees knocked down. There was nothing. So make of it what you will. That's the Blue Light Story. Thanks for listening.